Nope, but I can start the recording.
No, I just did. No, I just did. I thought somebody hit the record button. Ah, there it goes. All right, welcome everybody to the APAC steering. Wait, that's not the steering committee. Sorry, I'm getting them mixed up. The APAC community call. Today, our discussion is going to give you guys a preview of what the symposium is going to look like, as well as then play for you guys the Legend initiative that actually was discussed yesterday during the other community call. So, and then allow you guys to ask some questions if you guys have any questions. So, without further ado, I'm going to basically give you guys a heads up. I know we've talked about this already, but November 18th, Asian Pacific time is the symposium. We are starting at, if you look here, Korean Standard Time. This is pretty much a set agenda already. So, and if you haven't registered, I suggest that you go register because I think you're going to miss out on a lot if you don't register. How do you register? You can go to the APAC community calls right here under this, and then you will see down here a you can register now link. And if you click on it, then it will actually take you to the registration page where it asks you a couple of questions, okay? And once you fill it out, we'll send a confirmation email to you, and you'll know that you get whatever you need. Now, the one thing that we ask is that the last two questions, they are required. We need to know, because it's going to happen in MS Teams, Odyssey Teams. We need to know if you already have Teams, because if you don't, then we run into issues about you not being able to see the chats, as well as what email you use, because if you haven't, we're going to actually put you into Odyssey Teams. So if you don't have Odyssey Teams, make sure you let us know, and then we'll work with you. So you can see here, this is kind of the agenda that we've designed. We wanted to keep it somewhat formal, but at the same time, somewhat more informal, so folks can actually spend some time together as a community and get to know each other, but at the same time, progressing our community to help with our missions of next year and our vision of next year. So what you see is some of the leaders of the Odyssey community is going to come speak, right? We have George, Patrick, and then Peter, who's going to talk about Eden, which is the IMI initiative in Europe that's been working on OMOP conversions. And I know there's a lot of interest in FIRE. So FIRE and Odyssey is doing a collaboration, and it's already been kicked off and it's going right now. So we wanted to invite Christian to talk about what that means and how Asia Pacific can really participate in that. And what we then will wrap it up with is what are our visions for 2022. So every chapter has had their visions for 2021, and I have to say it's been a great success with many of the different chapters in 2021. So, but then how do we propel ourselves and continue that success into 2022? And the leaders will actually be talking about some of those visions. And during those visions, we're going to disclose a little poll that we're going to ask you to fill in that will help us better plan 2022. And that poll will actually also lead into some of the activities in the afternoon. So in the afternoon, we actually will move out of Teams and into a tool called GatherTown. I don't know how many of you guys participated in the symposium this year at the normal symposium. If you did, then you would have gotten an invitation to the Odyssey GatherTown environment. What it is, it's actually a virtual networking website that you don't need to download anything. It's a website. And what it looks like, looks like this. So you all get a preview of potentially what you're going to see. Okay, we're working on designing it. So don't take this as the ultimate way it looks like. But basically, you get an email and you log into the environment called GatherTown. You create your little avatar, and you have your mic on, and you can have your video on. And then what happens is you're in here we have different areas that you can walk towards. You can have private discussions with other people, like in these little spaces. You can have a drink at the bar, a virtual drink. And then we have discussion sessions set up, chapter sessions set up, chapter booths set up, as well as other stuff set up. So it's an environment that you're going to go into and basically be able to network with people. And you can see here, based on the agenda, there are different things that we're going to be talking about, right? So we have a group, a working session group booth time, because again, some of the activities that people are interested in, right? The CDM is coming out with 5.4. So what does that mean to us on for those who do have their data in OMOP? We're trying to get folks from Asia Pacific and Christian to talk about FIRE, those that are part of the FIRE community, to come and talk to us about how this collaboration might work. And you guys can go in there and ask basically questions that you want. Right. We're also have a collaboration showcase where there will be posters where folks can go around and walk and talk to the poster owners, as well as then later on, again, to propel us into 2022. We have different study sessions that folks can attend to talk about what kind of studies that we want to be doing in 2022. So, and of course, you don't have to go to any of these sessions. You can just be standing around and talking to people, if that's what you choose to do, and network. So as I showed you, there are tables that you can stand around, or you can just come close to each other. And then only the two of you will be hearing each other's conversations. You know, people around us won't hear anybody else's conversation unless you run right into their group. But we can do things like that. So that's really the agenda and what we have planned to make it somewhat formal, but also somewhat informal, where folks can gather together and help us as a community plan out 2022. So any questions there? Or can you no longer hear me? I take everybody being silent as you got me, and I'm good. You're good. Roger, you have your hands up.
Yeah, hey Mary. Interesting. So Christian's presenting on FIRE. Is this how actively is it being worked on at the moment? Because we're very interested in OMOP on FIRE, the Georgia Tech.
So this is something I know Georgia Tech and Christian and all of them are involved. I don't know enough about it, so I can't really answer, and that's why we want Christian to present, so that he brings more light over to the Asia Pacific community side, right? I know they have working groups that, or I'm sorry, not weekly, but constant meetings, regularly scheduled meetings that the two groups meet together. But that's also why we want to bring the experts that are both on the FIRE side in Asia Pacific and Christian together, so that you guys can ask questions. Like all the questions, like what you just asked, they can answer. I can't, right?
Yep. Oh, excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's what that session would be. Basically, you can just walk up to their little booth, and basically it's more of a question and answer session or a discussion session, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yes, it does. Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else? Cool. If you don't have anything else, so what I am going to actually play for everybody is the Legend Initiative, where these folks are going to talk about the previous Legend initiative, as well as what they're doing now, and then what their future plans are, right? I'm sure most of you guys know, we did in the OHDSI community a few years ago, did the Legend Hypertension project that ended up in the Lancet. And everybody, you know, in the community thought that was a great effort and wants to continue that type of effort. So Mark Shashard from UCLA is now leading the initiative, and I heard rumors they're now looking at type 2 diabetes. But again, these guys will give you a bit more insights on how it works and what are the efforts that are going on. Okay, I'm going to move that away and hit the play button. Tell me if you guys can hear, okay?
to Anna.
I can hear.
You can or cannot?
I cannot hear. Can anyone else hear, or is it me, or?
I can't. Doing.
I can't.
I know what I didn't do right, so give me a second. That's what happens when I forget to present this way in a long, long time. Let's see, where's that little... Now, let's see.
And I'd like to thank you for the opportunity that the Legend Initiative is going to take to talk about both research that we've completed and ongoing work and opportunities to get involved in generating reliable evidence for actionable healthcare decisions. But without any further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Anna Ostropolitz, a physician and PhD student at Columbia, to kick us off. Anna, please.
Thanks a lot, Mark. You can go right to the first slide. You may think, if you're not familiar with Legend, you may think of Legend as of yet another study on diabetes treatment or depression treatment or hypertension treatment. But in fact, there are key things that distinguish Legend from what you usually see in observational research. And when you think about the studies that are out there, researchers would usually pick one question, which means that they would investigate one target and one comparator treatment at a time. They would use whatever research methods they think are appropriate, which oftentimes results in them not really accounting for all of the potential source of bias. And then when you look at the published results, you would see that researchers mostly publish significant findings, which means that they oftentimes discard something that they feel is not interesting or some insignificant findings. And what Legend proposes and uses instead is a set of principles which allow for transparent, reproducible, and robust research. So what we do is we use the pre-specified design, which we publish in the form of protocol, and then we disseminate whatever results we obtain from the study to make sure that we avoid this publication bias. We use systematic process across all research questions to make sure that we really get these calibrated true estimates. We do it at a large scale, which means that we're examining thousands of treatments and run the analysis on multiple data sources. And of course, we use the best practices, which is large-scale propensity score modeling, really extensive diagnostics, use of negative and positive controls, and much more. And that already sounds good enough, but what you can see here is the way you can apply those principles in your own research. So what you would do when you start with the research question, instead of looking at one pair at a time, you can look at a drug class and you can examine multiple treatments and compare them. And you really want to spend a lot of time on designing your study. So you would like to make sure that you account for all of the potential sources of bias on the design stage. You probably want to come up with a multiple sensitivity analysis, like with the easy example being as treated and intent to treat. Then you would like also you can actually leverage the OHDSI tools such as cohort diagnostics to make sure that you'll be pursuing the question and using the cohorts that are comparable, and that you really account for all of these small details that make or break your study. You probably want to run it on a multiple databases, and here you can say that, okay, but what if I only have one data source at my disposal? And our answer will be that OHDSI provides you and any collaborator with this great opportunity to run a network study. So you can really leverage different data sources with a different provenance, with a lot of patients to make your analysis robust. And after that, when you run this analysis, you, similar to what we do in Legend, really want to spend a lot of time on diagnostics. You want to examine your prevalence score. You want to check the covariate balance. You want to make sure that you account for the systematic error by examining your calibration plots. And after all, you would like to publish all of your results. And the process outlined here would actually make your paper highly desirable paper to any journal. And Ray will follow up on that with a perfect example of the study published in a high impact journal, which resulted from the Legend study.
Thanks, Anna. So I have the privilege of sharing with you some of the existing work. For those of you who have been with the community for some time, you may recall a lot of these figures and analyses presented from the 2018 symposium. This was in quite a banner year for Legend. So the motivation behind very quickly behind the Legend hypertension study was that there were new guidelines released for hypertension in about 2017 and 2018. So in 2017, the ACC/AHA came out with new guidelines. In 2018, the European Society for Cardiology followed. However, across both these guidelines, there were multiple recommended first-line drug classes, a total of 5 drug classes spanning about 29 individual drugs. And as you can see on the figure in the right, the literature behind that really powered these guidelines and motivated these were still quite sparse in terms of direct head-to-head comparisons, with a lot of these being based on older RCTs that were done many decades ago. And the question was, could we help fill this gap in terms of the literature and the evidence and do a better job comparing a lot of these drugs more directly? So the primary manuscript was an effort led by Mark Suchard, which was ultimately published in 2019 in The Lancet, which was a class-level comparison across the 5 drug classes with 55 outcomes across 9 databases, which included the 3 primary outcomes of acute myocardial infarction, heart failure, and stroke. Also in this main manuscript, there were a total of almost 5 million patients, and Legend hypertension involved the running of over 20,000 calibrated and propensity score adjusted hazard ratios, as Anna had alluded to. Some of the key findings from the study were that thiazides were better than ACE inhibitors for primary effectiveness, and that non-dihydropyridine calcium channel blockers were inferior. And I think those were some of the key ones that came from it, and I think was a hugely impactful study. As a follow-up, there was also a question of within thiazides. Chlorthalidone had been around for a long time, and were often the medication that was used within trials, and supposedly it actually does have a longer half-life.
Nicole, good news. Our contract, the PHRN, has been signed. So I have attached the supply of services agreement for UNISA. I filled in most of the fields. And provided the ABN, first page, and
of that being potentially better than ACEs. George Ripsack led this study, and which was needed because there were no direct head-to-head comparisons, even though the VA did have a clinical trial in progress around this topic. And this paper ultimately came out in 2020 in JAMA Internal Medicine of this comparison. This was in 3 databases because we were limited to those with greater than 2,500 exposures, capturing about a little over 700,000 patients, and found no real difference in effectiveness. That's the figure that you can see right here, closer to the bottom on the bottom left. And on the bottom right, and on the right side, you'll see really the secondary endpoints and safety outcomes, which really reflect that hydrochlorothiazide actually had fewer renal and electrolyte abnormalities, which really reassures, I think, the scientific community and those on HCTZ that this was a safe choice. This was followed by Chan's paper in hypertension on beta blockers. Essentially, that the ACC guidelines no longer recommended beta blockers. However, the European guidelines still did. Beta blockers, we know, are a fairly heterogeneous class, with the third generations having more vasodilatory effects. So that would be like your carvedilol. There were a few direct comparisons against atenolol, and so we wanted to dig further into this class as well. This was again on 3 databases that had greater than 2,500 exposures, capturing almost 400,000 patients. And there's no significant difference between these third generation beta blockers and atenolol. However, there was a higher risk for stroke when we looked at these third generation beta blockers against ACEs or thiazides, suggesting that once again that perhaps beta blockers should not be as first line as some of these other ones. And this leads me quickly to the study I had the good fortune of leading, which was the ACE inhibitors versus Arb study. Once again, you'll see a recurring theme of these are equally recommended first-line therapies, act along the same physiologic pathway. But we know that ACE inhibitors are much more commonly used, even though we know they also have some side effects, like people may have heard of cough or angioedema being associated with ACEs. And we don't have enough in the literature head-to-head to compare. This ultimately was run on 8 databases because these are slightly more commonly used drugs. You ended up with about 2.3 million on ACEs and almost 700,000 on ARBs. And there was no significant difference in the primary outcomes, which included acute MI, heart failure, stroke, and a composite endpoint of those events. And this was published recently in Hypertension. Across 51 secondary and safety outcomes, there was a difference in pancreatitis, angioedema, cough, and GI bleed. The cough and angioedema were actually reassuring to see, and especially with particularly strong effects, because that's well-known side effects of the ACE inhibitors, as I mentioned before. And those two do remain significant, even with a fairly conservative Bonferroni correction. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Yuan Liu, who is an assistant professor at Yale, and an outstanding researcher and collaborator with the Legend Group.
Thank you, Ray. My name is Yuan. Today I'm going to share with you result of a new collaboration as an extension of the Legend Hypertension Initiative. A little bit background, all of the study that Ray just showed you have focused on monotherapy of hypertension as a first-line treatment. However, in practice, study shows 70% of patients with hypertension cannot achieve their blood pressure control target with monotherapy alone. So there's an important clinical question is that what is the optimal therapy for treatment escalation among patients with monotherapy who cannot achieve blood pressure control goal? So as an extension of the Legend Hypertension Initiative, we aim to conduct a large-scale observational study within the OHDSI community to characterize real-world utilization of dual combination therapies for hypertension among patients with hypertension. Next slide, please. So we look at all 5 major drug classes of antihypertensive medication. These include ACE or ARBs, calcium channel blocker, thiazide or thiazide diuretic, and beta blockers. We look at all the dual combination of this drug class. These generate 12 exposure cohorts. Next slide. Here we use 11 EHR data sources, mainly from the Asian Pacific countries. Many of these data partners are first time joining the OHDSI community. So we mobilize them using the Legend Hypertension principle that Anna just described, and I will also talk about some lessons learned from this new collaboration. Altogether, these 11 data sources cover 118 million patients across 8 countries and districts. Next slide. Now here is a table showing you the distribution of dual combination therapies across these 11 data sources. By just looking at this color, you can see there's variation in treatment utilization for hypertension escalation. For example, among the Australian database, cohort number 2 and number 3, which means starting ACE and ARB first, following by a calcium channel blocker or diuretics, are common in Australian database. But however, when you look at the Korean database, it seems cohort number 7 and number 8, studying CCB first, and then following by an ACE and ARBs or beta blockers are more common in this country. Next slide. We also found heterogeneities in treatment utilization by age and sex. Here I use IQVIA Australian database as an example. The first figure on the right-hand side shows different age distribution. The yellow color shows age 45 to 64 years old, whereas the blue color shows age 65 and older. So you can see that younger patients are more likely to be prescribed ACE and ARB than a CCB or diuretic compared to older patients. And at the bottom, this graph shows the gender difference. We see that women are more likely to be prescribed with diuretic first, and then following by an ACE and ARBs or calcium channel blocker compared to men. Next slide. And then here we're looking at a treatment pathway. Again, just selecting 2 databases as an example. Looking at the IQVIA US database and IQVIA Italian database, we see that large variation in treatment pathway across country. It seems in the US database, there's much more layers and more complexity in using the drug. Whereas in Italian, the layer are fewer, and you can see that more homogeneous treatment utilization pattern within the Italian database. Okay, next slide. Finally, just to summarize the key findings and lessons learned from this new collaboration, we found that large variation in transition between monotherapy and dual combination therapy for hypertension across different countries and by demographic subgroups such as age and sex. These will lay the foundation for the future research, which is to identify what is the best combination for which patient. Finally, a lesson learned from this study is that we found that using the legend hypertension principle is very helpful to mobilize collaboration with OHDSI data partners, because we all of us follow the same principles. However, we've also found that substantial effort was required to ensure data quality and alignment of method across these data sources. Even though all of these data partners map their EHR to OMAP common data model, the data quality vary, especially some of these data partners are first time entering the OHDSI community. So researchers need to pay attention to this issue when establish new collaboration and carefully examine the data quality. With that, I would like to turn over to my colleague, Dr. Rohan Kira, who is a promising cardiologist at Yale University, to talk about the Legend Diabetes Initiative.
Thank you, Ewan. And I'm glad to switch gears here. The success of Legend Hypertension ensured that we had to take in a new direction. And Legend Diabetes, type 2 DM, which is T2DM, is a mouthful, but it's actually an important advance for our community to go in a new direction. Please advance. And I think the key reason that I'm going to focus on is what is the motivation of doing Legend type 2 diabetes or Legend diabetes is the fact that we recognize that diabetes is a major problem in terms of causing both premature morbidity and premature mortality. Patients suffer from a combination of macrovascular disease, which is coronary artery disease, or which include and other atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease like strokes, heart attacks, as well as microvascular disease like nerve problems, neuropathy, or retinopathy. And please advance. And while we recognize that improving the glucose control or achieving better glycemic control reduces the risk of microvascular disease, next please, it has no known effect on the macrovascular disease. So even though we have focused diabetes management exclusively on blood glucose control, we actually do not impact either macrovascular disease or coronary artery disease or patients' risk of dying with this approach. Please, next slide. And this is the entirety of our current approach. So if we focus on our current guideline recommendations, they focus on identifying patients with type 2 diabetes based on an elevated blood sugar, and then going after the blood sugar as the target to treat. So our first-line therapies, often metformin, Metformin is a long-use safe drug in type 2 diabetes management with some modest benefit even on the macrovascular side. But then most patients are unable to be managed on metformin alone and still have elevated blood sugars. This leads to a second-line array of second-line drug therapies, each with a different mechanism of action, as well as a different approach towards lowering blood glucose. There are many drugs in these classes, and within these classes, there are individual drugs. We focus on 4, which are the most widely used drug classes. Next, please. And I think the key aspect I want to highlight that all these drugs have an effect on blood glucose control and are used effectively for that indication. There is a substantial variability in how they affect cardiovascular risk. So the most commonly used second-line drug, sulfonylurea, which increase the secretion of insulin from the pancreas, they have never been evaluated in large-scale cardiovascular outcomes, RCTs, because that was never the strategy of evaluating these drugs. Newer classes of drugs that focus on different mechanisms, including DPP-4 inhibitors, were actually tested in cardiovascular outcome studies that were based on a recommendation from the FDA to assess this in these sort of large trials. And the newer drugs that have been tested in this class have a neutral effect. However, 2 promising drug classes have emerged, including SGLT2 inhibitors, which in large cardiovascular outcome trials have shown to reduce the risk of MI, death, and heart failure for most drugs in these classes. Similarly, GLP-1 receptor agonists, which are injectable drugs, also have reduced the risk of cardiovascular risk. Next slide, please. However, even though we recognize that these drugs are all available in clinical practice, there is currently no evidence to choose one over the other based on head-to-head direct evidence. People have tried to do indirect meta-analyses, which compare with a common control versus the relative difference between these agents and their control arms, but that's highly limiting. Therefore, our focus is on improving the understanding of which drugs may be superior in lowering cardiovascular risk with these in diabetes. And there is a critical need to use real-world evidence or real-world data to generate evidence to guide this decision. With this hope in mind, we actually identified 2 key aims for Legend diabetes. Next slide, please. The first is to evaluate the relative cardiovascular effectiveness and safety of all second-line antihyperglycemic drug classes, which I mentioned in the previous slide. And then, because there are multiple drugs in these classes with varying amounts of evidence for their cardiovascular effectiveness and safety, we wanted to focus on individual drugs of the second-line antihyperglycemic drug classes to study in Legend type 2 diabetes. And with that, I'll hand it over to Aki.
Thank you, Rohan. So as it should be clear to the audience by now, Legend is a real-world data analytics at really an unprecedented scale. And as such, it often reveals some of the shortcomings of the existing statistical techniques. And in the Legend spirit of generating reliable evidence, it's important for OHDSI to address these shortcomings as we discover them. So I'll discuss the challenges and opportunities around the causal inference techniques for survival outcomes, and Pham will describe her ideas on how to carry out evidence synthesis on a federated data network model. Next slide, please. So here are some results from a positive control experiment using plasmode synthetic data. This experiment investigating bias and root mean squared errors in the treatment effect estimates. And different estimators vary in their methods for estimating propensity score, but they all use propensity score matched Cox regression model to estimate the treatment effect. And matched Cox regression is the current gold standard for survival analysis, and it's also what the OHDSI uses. And what this plot clearly shows you is that the matched Cox regression is biased. Now you could argue that this is not the worst type of bias because it's a bias towards a null, inflating false negative, but it's still a bias nonetheless. Next slide, please. So this bias in Cox model is actually a well-known issue, and there has been, in the causal inference literature, there has been alternative proposals that has better theoretical properties. But the best method in theory is not always the best method in practice. Next slide, please. Yeah, and some causal inference expert has argued that the match-Fox regression actually works better than other method, despite in a practical setting, despite its shortcomings. So what I'm working on with my colleague Betsy Ogburn and our student Xia Xu is to implement a range of state-of-the-art causal survival inference techniques and systematically evaluate their performance in the real-world legend setting. And with that, I'll hand it over to Fan Bu, who is a hotshot postdoc in the Mark Suchard group at UCLA.
Thank you, Aki. So next, I will discuss emerging methods on evidence synthesis across federated data sources. So in the OHDSI network, the typical way of doing studies is to execute analyses at separate data sites and then combine the findings. Now the method we're using is the traditional method where we get a point estimate for the effect we care about and then use meta-analysis methods to combine those point estimates to get an overall point estimate for the effect. This method is simple, but it does have some limitations. Next slide, please. For example, if we have rare events with small or zero counts at a particular data site, then the likelihood function we'll need for getting a point estimate would be monotonic, meaning we cannot get a maximum likelihood estimate from this. So the traditional method will simply throw away this entire data site, losing us a lot of information. With that, there has been emerging alternative frameworks, next slide please, that can address such information loss issues. So instead of simply combining summary statistics from different data sites, we now can actually directly combine the likelihood functions. Now here, a likelihood function can be thought of as a profile containing the full data evidence needed for inferences. In such a new framework, we can use Bayesian or numerical methods to combine all those different shapes of likelihood functions, giving us an overall likelihood profile that we can use for getting a point estimate and also uncertainty quantification. Now this new and flexible framework, next slide please, can also help us address challenges, more challenges at hand on top of the small or zero counts issue. For example, we can combine with empirical calibration methods to address systematic errors. So this can help us debias our effect estimates. Moreover, we can potentially incorporate latent community detection methods to account for community level confounding. So this can help us explain away some effect heterogeneity across patient groups and across data sets. So with that, let me hand it to the legendary Mark Suchard, who's a leader of the Legend Initiative and also a leading researcher in OHDSI, to give concluding remarks.
Bon, thank you very much for passing the baton over to me. I'd like to take this opportunity to let the community know that Legend Type 2 Diabetes is ready to kick off. Unfortunately, Craig stole my thunder last week by announcing that the medRxiv preprint of the entire protocol for the Legend study is out in the wild, ready for everyone's feedback. But perhaps more importantly, it has now been officially registered with the EU PASS system. For those of you not familiar with the EU PASS registry, it's much like clinicaltrials.gov here in the US, but not just for clinical trials, for all observational studies. So that supports the OHDSI ideas of sort of open science, in that we will pre-specify and publish ahead of time exactly what types of analyses we're interested in doing at scale. In addition to finalizing the protocol, we have also completed preliminary exposure and outcome cohort diagnostics across a number of different data sources, including 3 different large US claims data sources, 2 different very large US EHR data sources, including in the VA and Optum EHR, 2 different US academic EHR systems, and internationally the EHR system in Singapore. So the formal start date for this study, now that we have these diagnostics in hand and we're looking for participants, is November 1st. To participate in Legend Type 2 Diabetes, you'll have to use the Legend Type 2 Diabetes study package, which is being distributed as an OHDSI Network R study package from GitHub. Over here on the left, I have a clip of the face page. At the bottom of the face page, there's an extensive README document that gives you both the requirements and the first steps that you'll need to generate cohorts, characterize those cohorts, and begin with the analysis itself. In order to participate, as a data partner, you'll need data that is ETL'd into OMOP CDM version 5, and our executables run against R 4.05. Within the study package itself, we're using the REMV environment to make sure that all dependencies are up to date and available upon installation. And Jose Posada has been very nice to provide a test Docker file for our data partners who can use containerization. So if you are interested in participating, cohort characterization is ready for execution across our network. So please consider contributing as a data partner. No work is ever done in a vacuum, and unfortunately, almost no work gets done by me these days. So I'd like to give a huge shout out to the large team of participants in Legend Hypertension and Legend Diabetes, and also to let the larger community know that this is an open initiative, and if you're interested in participating in the scientific development and in the clinical characterization and studies that we're moving forward to with Legend Diabetes and the underlying statistical work, to please consider joining us. We meet on the 2nd and 4th, and my favorite Thursday, occasionally the 5th Thursday of every month at 12 p.m. Eastern Time on Teams. I've provided a couple of links to the published study protocol and the study package. If you're interested in participating in the study or joining the work or joining the initiative, please contact me either by Teams or more preferably from via email. And with that, I'd like to stop screen sharing and open this up to a discussion and questions from the community.
Cool, with that, I will stop playing. Any questions from the group? Can you guys still hear me?
Yes.
Yes. I think that is a cool. I want to say for the Singapore chapter, it's wonderful to see you guys part of the initial initiative, participating in it. So that's great. Kudos to you guys. And I think more, Asia Pacific folks should participate, and you guys are taking the lead on it. So wonderful effort.
Thanks. Great thanks to Selva. We'll pick this up quickly and then, act quickly. Yeah.
I see Jessica has a question or has her hands up.
Yeah, is it possible and then for them to put the email address on the chat messaging?
Yes, it's really just Mark's email address, so it's.
Thank you.
Let me make sure I type his email. If you have OHDSI Teams, he's easy to find. You just type Mark in, and he's the only one.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah,
okay.
He's the first one. Yeah. So it's easier to just chat him as well. So Mark Shashard, if you chat with him, he'll respond to you pretty quickly in Teams. He's always in Teams. So yeah, but you can email him as well.
Yeah, thanks.
You're welcome. Anyone else? I mean, the folks that are on this study, if I show my screen again, they're from, Yale, UCLA, Johns Hopkins. So they're pretty pretty powerful or amazing people, right? Harlan, I know Yuan, they're both from Yale. Mark is from UCLA. Patrick is Columbia. Anna is Columbia. Ray is Columbia. George is Columbia. Aki is now Johns Hopkins. He was at UCLA. So quite a few folks on here that has helped develop this package. And you know, from the previous slide, they actually verified it against quite a few data assets first before putting out this protocol. So it would be an interesting one to see more folks, especially in the Asia Pacific one, participate, given that the first hypertension one, we didn't have a lot of participation from Asia Pacific. So I'm pleading to you guys, you know, here, my pleading, that, you know, more Asia Pacific data assets participate. That's why we also wanted to play this. Cool. Well, if nobody has any questions, if you haven't signed up, please make sure you sign up for the symposium. If your friends don't know about it, please help us spread the word as well. More people welcomed to the symposium. And same thing with the legend. If you guys have an interest, please go and participate and sign up for it. If you can't get a hold of Mark, let me know, and I will connect you to Mark as well. So. All right, well, thank you very much. If we have no more questions, I will give you guys back 9 minutes. Awesome, thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thanks, Marie. Goodbye.
Bye.